He had spent 2 years perfecting the aristocratic sneer that passed for analysis in staff tents and map vans. The German colonel, 38, spare, with a pencil mustache that he trimmed as if it were a figure on a balance sheet, taught younger officers how to read a battlefield. He preferred verbs: encircle, feint, penetrate, exploit. Adverbs bored him unless they described speed. Nouns like tonnage or octane were for quartermasters, a caste he accepted as necessary the way riders accept saddles. Waste, he told the room, was an allied disease. "Look at the British and now the Americans," he would say, showing photographs from the weekly intelligence folder. Pipelines lying like snakes over sand, drums stacked higher than a man, tank transporters carrying tanks instead of tanks carrying themselves. They use 2 to do the work of 1. Waste. It makes their generals lazy. The majors laughed because a clever man had given them absolution for the contempt they already felt. The colonel made a note to himself. Confidence is a ration you can issue in peacetime quantities until the war takes it away. In the Libyan dawn, confidence could sound like an engine at idle, a low mechanical purr under canvas, while officers ate bread that tasted like canvas too. The colonel stood in a doorway that was not a doorway, just 2 pieces of wood pretending to frame a space, and watched trucks queue for fuel. It was October 1942, and the line thickened like an apology. Drivers leaned against fenders and blew on hands as if warmth might remind the gauges to be generous. A corporal counted jerrycans and wrote a number that already felt like memory in a notebook softened by sweat and sand. Far off, toward the tell that British maps called Kidney Ridge, artillery rehearsed with economy. The colonel looked left and saw a truck with 2 flat tires and a driver studying both, as if deciding which one to hate first. He looked right and saw a mechanic shake a filter and scowl when a clot of dust fell out like a cough. Somewhere behind him, a major spoke the name of a captured fuel dump at Tobruk, as if the syllables could ferment into gasoline anew. The colonel, who had been born far from deserts and had learned to mistrust anything that did not grow trees, waited for his Batman to bring coffee and said aloud to no one, "Waste is the privilege of fools." He did not know then that he was rehearsing a line he would swallow 10 weeks later in a place where the world had been rearranged by numbers larger than pride. He did not know that he would walk across a captured American forward refuel point on the coastal road west of El Aguila and stop at a sign chalked in a hand as casual as a grocery list. Filling point C, 50,000 gallons, and experience the collapse of a philosophy. He would stand at the edge of a tidy rectangle of drums with stenciled U.S. markings and hear in his mind the pop of every staff joke he had ever told about Allied excess. He would see the hoses coiled like polite snakes and the wooden planks laid across sand so drivers did not bog, and the quiet men with clipboards who made the sea into fuel and fuel into violence on schedule. And he would understand, finally, what people mean when they say, obvious. 50,000 gallons makes defeat obvious the way a sky full of airplanes makes humility inevitable. That day would arrive soon. For now, the colonel's map rolled itself back to the day's fight. Mine lanes to be probed, artillery firing tables to be judged like students, a request from Panzer Regiment 8 for the gasoline that had already been promised twice to someone else who also needed it to live. Before the colonel learned to respect arithmetic, he leaned harder on romance. Panzer Army Africa had danced from Ajdabiya to Gazala and back again, and he had written orders on half a dozen cars as if automobiles existed to be his desks. He had watched Ariete's M13s hold a pocket as neatly as a stone holds water in a stream, and he had watched Trieste stand up to abuse with a patience he would later call Roman. When Tobruk fell on June 21st, 1942, he stood on a height and saw a harbor of luck. Tankers in berth, crates of bully beef stacked into abstract art, British workshops full of spares he could read like a folio of coins. For 7 days the army ate, captured plenty, and spoke again about Alexandria, as if it were a small debt to be collected after lunch. He signed orders that assumed a future. Then the future took its own advice. The desert lengthened, the Mediterranean narrowed, Malta remained. He learned new nouns: kill rate, drop-off, transit loss. His staff captain brought ultra-proofed summaries that the colonel pretended not to believe, because believing meant rewriting plans, and rewriting plans meant explaining to men who liked verbs why nouns had won. He visited Tripoli to shame himself into patience. The port showed him an education. Cranes creaked with the burnt sugar smell of seawater on iron. The lip of the quay wore a permanent expression of rust. Italian dockers moved drums with the force of men who have learned that anger cannot make a load lighter. A British raid scattered men and birds with equal contempt, and when the noise ended, a whistle blew, and someone made a joke that became a shovel. The colonel stood with a harbor officer who chain-smoked and cursed in elegant Italian. "They always come when the cranes are tired," the officer said, not looking at him. "They are gentlemen that way." A destroyer escort at anchor thumped like a drunk who has remembered a song, and the colonel wrote a line in his notebook: "Enemy attacks docks for interruption more than destruction." Interruptions turned into late convoys, turned into columns that arrived at the front with fuel like a rumor instead of a promise. Algebra, the colonel's least favorite language, turned movement into subtraction. He rode once with a column on the road east of Benghazi and learned something he should have learned sooner. The desert punishes schedules. Departure times are good for making officers feel tall. Arrival times belong to bearings, tires, and the god of radiators. At noon, a lorry's fan belt shredded itself into a parody of rope. At 2, a sidewall failed, and the spare was already a spare of a spare with a patch that had lost its will to believe. At 4, a British fighter bomber stitched a line 50 meters to the left, like an editor correcting stage directions. At 6, the column crept into a wadi and became a museum of stillness until night decided to help. Men drank a hotness that called itself tea, and chewed bread that called itself food, and the colonel did the only honorable thing a visiting staff man can do in a place where his presence is an irritation. He carried jerrycans. The smell of gasoline climbed into his lungs and found a shelf near memory. It would live there when the sign reading 50,000 gallons broke him in December. First, Alaman forced humility into logs that had not worn it before. Staffmen under Auchinleck wrote maps out of improvisation, and the colonel, the idea of him anyway, had been trained to tease improvisation into error. He had done it at the Cauldron. He had watched the British run with their heads turned. In July, something in the British face changed. Brigade sat still when his doctrine said they should panic. The lines felt deeper than they looked. Minefields became opinions with teeth. The Desert Air Force laid a lid on the daylight that made it sound like evening even at noon. The colonel told a captain to send a message to the Luftwaffe about fighter sweeps over the Via Balbia, and the captain, who was a careful man, replied, "Sir, the message exists. The answer is already here." The answer was a column hit twice, and then choosing to hide rather than risk a third. Courage gives lectures. Fuel gives grades. Alam el-Halfa made him suspect that God worked part-time as a quartermaster. Rommel's hook, south and east, was a page the colonel could have turned blindfolded, and he had annotated that page with petrol consumption rates and resupply times in a tone that revealed his disdain for such chores. The Desert Air Force, instructed by people who could read other people's mail, insulted the columns from morning to afternoon. Mine's pride treads off track runs with the engineering humor of a prankster who refuses to laugh. There is a look men get when the tank they sit in becomes a chair. He saw rows of that look and wrote to himself, "We will spend the next week proving this was an armed reconnaissance, as if we meant it that way." It was dishonest, but necessary. He walked the line that night and saw mechanics doing surgery on engines under blankets, a shame cure for mosquitoes with a side use as blackout. A sergeant muttered to his carburetor, "Just one more day," the way a man mutters to a lover on a platform. The colonel realized that in desert warfare, romance and repair share a vocabulary. He had always enjoyed berating the British for their love of pieces, transporters, bulldozers, pipelines. It made him feel clean to represent the German preference for using the thing as its own solution. Tank drives, gunfires, officer directs without intermediation. Then he saw British transporters deliver a brigade to a place where his maps did not believe men could be so soon, and he watched bulldozers push a track over a field of stones that his drivers would have treated as a reason to camp instead of a reason to move. And he saw a pipeline appear where the earliest drafts of his mind believed only jerrycans would ever go. He called it waste because the alternative was to call it future. He told one of his peers, a man so thrifty with emotion that he had never even bought a dog, "They overdo everything." The peer, who had the watery eyes of a brilliant drinker, replied, "Yes, and then they do not run out." Night raids by small men in big courage adjusted his temper in increments. The SAS blew depots with the clean economy of men who chose their charges like words. The LRDG arrived at roadheads like grammar police and wrote "no" across places where "yes" had lived. The colonel signed a paper exhorting drivers to disperse and to park under netting made from the remains of an older netting, and he commissioned a sergeant with a flair for sarcasm to paint a sign. Camouflage is cheaper than coffins. But dispersion turned convoys into conversations that wandered away from purpose. Netting gave men an excuse to stay still when moving was hard. The word cheaper did not remember that in the desert, cheaper is a kind of coin that buys time and nothing else. He began to hate the word waste in his own mouth. It had lost purchase. Men were dying with empty canteens and empty tanks, and a word that used to be a weapon had become a rumor. The colonel did not meet Ultra. He met its effects. A convoy that should have arrived at Benghazi on Wednesday reached Tripoli on Sunday, -1 tanker and +1 superstition. He requested spare fuel pumps for his division's trucks and received an answer in components because the Italians had the pumps and the Germans had the gaskets and the British had the time. In a better war, He might have sat in a library and admired the elegance of an opponent who read his mail and planned accordingly. In this war, he sat on a crate that had once held corned beef and planned how to lie nicely to a regiment whose map arrows would now have to shrink. He wrote that the regiment must husband its resources. The lieutenant who read the order laughed and said, "Sir, the resources have never been married." Second El Alamein began with a sound that happens only when men with calendars and engineers with pencils have agreed long ago on a night. The colonel counted seconds between salvos and measured consumption from the shape of the sound. He had learned to do this in Russia in 1941. It had become a parlor trick in his mind. He did it again out of habit and discovered the trick no longer entertained. British guns shot like a factory. The colonel had seen factories. Factories win. When he wrote an order for a counterattack, he wrote it as if the tanks existed, as if the fuel Bowsers would arrive, as if the maintenance park were not already a field hospital for metal. The counterattack went forward on scolded fumes, touched the enemy like a handshake done out of politeness, and came back less because it had pretended to be more. The colonel did not tell jokes that night. He was learning to speak the language of subtraction aloud. Retreat, he discovered, has more verbs than advance. Abandon, destroy, spike, bury, deny, root, regroup, delay. He did all of them and added improvise. He signed an order to remove tracks from dead tanks to save live ones. He commandeered civilian lorries with the assurance of a man who has borrowed and returned in better times. Now he borrowed and promised a return he could not guarantee. He watched a Luftwaffe officer argue with a RAF bomb that had not read the memorandum and kill 3 of his drivers by insisting that gravity did not respect rank. He told himself that the soldiers still believed in him. He did not ask them. Men do not ask mirrors whether they are handsome during a fire. They wash their faces and get on with it. The map rolled west past Buerat and to the Mareth line like a tongue burned by coffee, moving too carefully to taste. American pressure from the north and west complicated his sense of direction. He had once given a lecture about simplicity at a staff school. Now the bracket of Allied weight turned his lecture into a eulogy for a habit. He wrote his wife that he had learned new respect for Americans, a nation he had previously accused of owning only material and appetite. "They know how to count," he wrote. "It is not romantic, but it wins. Their waste is not waste. It is amplitude." He had never used that word before. It pleased him even in defeat. Amplitude meant he could not control the volume in the room anymore. And then the sign. December had bent into itself, the sun honest, the wind a gossip. The colonel's car rolled over the coastal road past an Allied petrol point that had belonged to someone else yesterday, and to him today, not by right, but by happenstance. He climbed out because a man who has been wrong should stand when he learns it. A wooden board, chalked in a neat American hand, said, "Filling point C, 50,000 gallons." The number did not impress the desert. It impressed him. 50,000 gallons. The drums stood in formal ranks, each with a stenciled code that made a man in a warehouse in Egypt feel useful. Hoses lay as if asleep. A corporal's clipboard showed the morning's issues. A pipeline, an American line, he assumed from the fittings, though everything was a coalition now, ran into a bermed tank with a lid that would keep sun and mischief out. The colonel touched a drum, because that is what men do when thinking about the past. It was cool. He looked at his adjutant, a student of his jokes for 2 years, and smiled. "We have been wrong about waste," he said. "This is not waste. This is victory learning to read." The adjutant, who was 24 and a farmer's son from near Lübeck, nodded as if his father had just told him when to plant potatoes. "They save time with fuel," the adjutant said. "We save fuel with time." The colonel felt the kind of happiness that comes only from clarity, the kind that tastes like clean water. 50,000 gallons explained the last 2 months. It explained why night raids had slowed but had not stopped convoys, why fighter bombers had arrived more often than reason allowed, why mines had been cleared in lanes wider than his doctrine permitted, why transporters had delivered tanks where roads had not existed in his imagination. 50,000 gallons meant someone had decided the desert would not be allowed to choose the hour anymore. He had always thought that was his job. He walked the dump with a humility he would later try to keep. Each section showed a craft he had dismissed as bureaucracy, drum testing with a mallet and ear, the careful staging of first in, first out to keep fumes from reading more than the human schedule. Spilled trenches arranged not to feed fire if the gods chose to mock. The paper trail from ship to railhead to pipe to hose, a story that made a clerk a soldier and a soldier a clerk by turns. He spoke with a British sergeant assigned to help transfer the cash to forward points now that the front had moved. The sergeant had a face that remembered sleep as a rumor. "We drew a bit from the Yanks this week," the sergeant said, owning the coalition the way men own weather. "They wanted to run 2 columns, and we wanted to run 1, so we ran 3, split the difference." The colonel laughed without cruelty for the first time in months. Waste, he realized, is what a losing man calls a winning man's insurance policy. On the way back, he wrote down numbers to make sense of the revelation. A panzer regiment on the march at fighting speed could drink tens of thousands of liters in a day. 50,000 gallons could feed or starve a decision, depending on who owned the hoses. He converted gallons to liters, liters to kilometers, kilometers to hours of pressure applied. He did the arithmetic of what the British would do with a dump like this, and then what the Americans could do. He admitted to the page that his army had stopped being able to decide in the operational sense weeks earlier. It had been reacting to other people's sums. The colonel had become an accountant in self-defense. He met a young RAF pilot the next morning when the line paused for a resupply that did not arrive and his car broke down and he had to accept a lift to a liaison point. The pilot, cheerful in a way that would have offended him a month ago, spoke about road watch and pattern recognition. "You learn the color of a convoy by its dust," the pilot said. "Italian dust is patient, German dust is organized, American dust is loud." He explained how reconnaissance had taught him to spot a disguised tanker and how a single stick of bombs on a road fork did not need to destroy a truck to destroy a plane. The colonel felt the world reweigh itself toward the men who turned lines on maps into choices from the cockpit. Waste, again, melted into a calculation. Bomb now and save a battalion later, or save your bombs for the third fork because Ultra said Tuesday, not Monday. "We listen more than we look," the pilot added. The colonel wrote that down too. By the new year, the colonel's correspondence to headquarters had changed tone. He no longer asked for miracles. He asked for time to evacuate workshops and for permission to destroy dumps whose creation had cost months of hope. He sent a note to a subordinate that read, "Stop pretending bad news is a phase. Write it as a fact, and I will write orders we can afford to obey." He answered one reply from above with a sentence that would not win him a medal. "We cannot outfight sums." He knew it was the sort of line that made political officers nervous. He signed it anyway because he had walked past 50,000 gallons and learned to be polite to reality. The men under him responded to his new honesty by fighting better in retreat. He yielded ground on a clock, not on a scream, and men obeyed because clocks are easier to respect than screams. He rotated units through workshops that had not been built to absorb such burdens and sent them forward with spares that had learned to be friends. He told a regimental surgeon he could choose which wounded went first, without asking permission, and then wrote the paperwork later to make what had been humane look like it had been authorized. He moved at night when moving at night was cheaper in blood, even if it cost bearings and sleep. He let his anti-tank guns die only when they had already had children in the form of a wrecked enemy tank. He stopped lecturing about Allied waste, because every time he began to speak, the image of the chalkboard, 50,000 gallons, rose up and asked him not to be an idiot. When Meereth loomed, a French line made new, he knew it would not be a final refuge, but a classroom for another army learning a lesson he had learned on the coastal road. That supply is a teacher with a cane. The Americans arrived in their way, impatient and brave and sometimes silly, and then not silly at all when their logistics arrived as advertised. The British pressed with the temper of a people who have chosen to be boring on purpose. The colonel surrendered a hobby, critiquing the enemy's style, in favor of a discipline, noting the enemy's stamina. He saw in the convoys that chased him the same handwriting he had admired in the dump, the same numbering, the same hoses, the same sergeants who looked like clerks and could outrun clerks when it mattered. He told a lieutenant that he would rather fight men who showed off than men who showed up. The lieutenant did not understand at first. Then a week passed, and he did. The last weeks do not need adjectives. The colonel's army folded in places where the ground had once pretended to be loyal. Colleagues went into captivity with expressions that forgot their grooming. He burned a file because it contained the jokes he no longer believed, and kept a file because it contained a map that would interest a historian who had never smelled gasoline. At a crossroads west of Gabe's, he watched an American petroleum unit set up a forward refuel in 20 minutes with a choreography that made him think of theaters he had loved as a boy. A corporal whistled. A lieutenant checked a gauge. A driver stepped onto a plank. 50,000 gallons became 52, then 48, then 46. Numbers as weather. The colonel said to himself, "This is what we meant by blitzkrieg, and they have married it to warehouses." He wished he had learned to admire that marriage before it took his job as a critic away. Captivity, when it came, brought him to a wire camp where an American officer asked if he spoke English. He did. The American offered him a cigarette and a question. "What surprised you most?" The colonel looked at the cigarette the way a hungry man looks at bread and took his time. "How patient your fuel is," he said. The American frowned, then smiled. "We try to make it arrive early," he answered. The colonel nodded. "That is what I mean. Your petrol has manners, ours had habits. He spent the next weeks teaching younger prisoners how to draw maps that forgive disappointment and how to read Allied convoys without maidenly jealousy. He told them the chalkboard story like a parable. Many laughed, a few listened. You can tell who will command later by who writes down jokes told at their own expense. He wrote one last letter to his wife before the mail grew uncertain. He did not mention the surrender. He mentioned the sun, which he had learned to hate less. He mentioned men, whom he had learned to love more when they were honest under impossible orders. He mentioned the pipeline and the chalkboard and the smell of a drum cool in shade. Waste, he wrote, is a word that hides fear and envy. We did not have enough to waste. They had enough to save. I see now that is the difference. He closed with an apology. I taught arrogance, and the students died well but too soon. For those who make documentaries and books and arguments afterward, the Colonel's story is a way to connect cockpit, convoy, and command post without lying. A pilot who strafes a road does not merely hit trucks. He adjusts the clock in a tent. A submariner who sends a tanker down does not merely destroy fuel. He lengthens a desert. A general who insists on a stockpile before a battle does not merely hoard. He changes the verbs his brigades can use next week. At El Alamein and after, pipelines under sand made the map shallow enough that plans could be written with thick pens. At Alam el Halfa, air attack turned ambition into patience, at exactly the moment patience would kill rather than save. At Tobruk, a windfall of British tins and barrels bought weeks. At the filling point beyond El Aguila, 50,000 gallons bought the Colonel's conversion. In the years after the war, when he returned to a Germany that had to learn the arithmetic of rebuilding, the Colonel found that his sneer had become a reflex. He could now resist. He worked in a small office that allocated fuel to hospitals and kitchens and buses that returned to routes whose names he had forgotten at the front. He insisted on records neat enough to explain themselves and watched young clerks develop the habits that had looked like dullness in the desert and were actually civilization. He wrote an article that no one important read at the time about logistics as an ethic, and signed it with initials because he did not want to be a character in somebody else's romance. In his desk he kept a photograph that his adjutant had taken on a captured camera. A chalkboard, a hose, a shadow of a man touching a drum. Some visitors thought it a study in composition. He thought it a study in defeat and education. Two words that often shake hands when pride steps away. If you need an ending to put under titles, you can say that a German colonel scoffed at Allied waste until 50,000 gallons taught him a better vocabulary. If you need a conclusion for people who will live without wars and still want to recognize danger when it visits their offices, you can say this. The map obeys the ledger sooner or later. Tanks follow pipes. Courage reads schedules. Men who laugh at warehouses end their stories earlier than men who stock them. The desert is a teacher that smiles without kindness. It shows the jokes to be expensive and the arithmetic to be free. And in that classroom, the student who arrives with 50,000 gallons of manners is the one who passes the course and writes the syllabus for the next time foolishness pretends to be genius. At staff school between wars, the colonel had memorized Moltkean aphorisms the way a tenor memorizes an aria. He brought them west in 1941, optimistic and armed with scorn for armies that lounged behind supply columns the way dandies lounge behind valets. In Cyrenaica, the first year rewarded that scorn. British brigades fell back not because they were stupid, but because their watches were set to a different hour, and because their orders were surrounded by other orders from other theaters. The colonel wrote letters home that sounded like proclamations. He was polite about the Italians in public and dismissive in private, then abruptly grateful in the weeks when divisions named Ariete or Trieste saved his campaign from folding into tragedy. He mistook gratitude for license to keep his philosophy and called it realism. It was luck. In 1942, luck began to take bribes from the other side. The convoy tables in his diary look today like a child's math, but felt then like a cosmology. Ship A departs Naples with 4,000 tons fuel and 2,000 tons general cargo. Escorts B, C, D. Probability of arrival, 50% in April, 62 in May, 38 in June. Probability is a word that flatters the indifference of air and sea. When Malta's squadrons recovered from famine and hit their stride, the probabilities turned rude. A single torpedo on a tanker was a Rosetta Stone. It translated optimism into planning failure instantly and everywhere. The colonel learned to write notes in pencil. He learned to believe the pencil. He learned that the phrase, "arrived partially," is a logistical way of crying. In the desert, he adopted a habit from an old cavalryman in the staff. Carry a small set of scales. They were a jeweler's scales, absurd under a desert sky, and he used them to weigh random bolts and washers to check whether shipments matched their manifest weights. "It makes embezzlement and error feel seen," the old man said. The colonel discovered that virtue scaled up. When men believe the ledger pays attention, they try to tell the truth. When the ledger is a stranger, they tell stories. The British ledger knew the names of hoses. The American ledger knew the color of gaskets. He had once called that fussiness decadent. It turned out to be another name for respect, for time, for distance, for the men who have to decide whether a lifter can hold a drum at arm's length twice in an hour or only once. The British obsession with minefields offended his maneuver sense until he learned the arithmetic behind it. Every mine lifted by a sapper is a liter of fuel saved by a tank that doesn't have to drive around the field twice. Every hour a flail or a dozer spends clearing a lane is a day saved for a supply column next week, because the route can accept traffic without prayer. He had thought mines were a statement. No, they were a sentence. Go here and not there, at this speed and not that. He watched a British sapper officer explain his lane plan to a truck master, using words that would be at home in a warehouse. "We can accept 16 vehicles per minute on this lane without breakdown. If you push 20, I will see you tomorrow with your own dead tires." That is what 50,000 gallons buys. The authority to set rules that keep your system alive while it kills other men's plans. The colonel read captured ultra summaries. He never saw the word, only the effect, and noticed their tone. Not triumph, not glee. Accounting. Convoy Z expected to depart Taranto on X, weather Y, countermeasures to include raid at A, and ambush at B. He envied the quiet. His own staff papers had begun to acquire italics and exclamation points. Italics mean panic written by educated men. Exclamation points mean hope pretending to be a plan. 50,000 gallons erase italics. They remove the need for punctuation other than a period and a date. Inside Panzer Army Africa's vehicle parks, cannibalization produced a different literature. Mechanics kept notebooks with the names of trucks written in pencil and the names of parts written in grease. They married and divorced gearboxes with the weariness of a priest who loves the ceremony but distrusts the couples. The colonel took to reading these notebooks for comfort because they were honest. Took half a propeller shaft from 3.7 AA to keep 88 motor alive. Rebuilt carb from 3, none of which was correct. No more proper rubber sleeves, cut from inner tubes. Pray. They were acts of devotion recorded without an altar. He understood that an army powered by devotion loses to an army powered by delivery schedules. He also walked Allied dumps when he could, studying labels like a scholar. The Americans stamped everything with numbers that revealed a theology of interchangeability. A pump that fit here also fit there. A hose that mated to this valve would not leak on that. He had loved German particularity until particularity betrayed him with the sentence, "We cannot supply that part this week." The Americans had decided in advance to be average in a way that made them always sufficient. He carried that insult for a month before learning to admire it. Perfection is a poem. Standard is a road. On the day the colonel spoke to the British sergeant at the dump, he noticed the way the sergeant's crew treated spill with a pedant's pride. Sand was scraped and replaced where fuel had kissed it. A small dike was repaired after a truck bumped it. A lid was replaced properly when a private left it crooked. "Why so fussy?" the colonel asked, genuinely curious and increasingly free of contempt. The sergeant shrugged. "Because messing up is contagious," he said. The colonel wrote it in his book and later underlined it because he realized why his army had begun to fray. Exhaustion bred shortcuts, and shortcuts bred failures disguised as speed. When the Allied Road Watch pilots told him they listened more than looked, he thought about his own reconnaissance reports. They had grown theatrical. Enemy columns flee, when the reality was mundane. Enemy columns move on schedule. He had mocked Allied waste, and now saw the waste was his language. It burned energy to carry contempt. He began to speak more slowly, and to choose nouns he had once despised. Pump, hose, gasket, bearing. They are not glorious, they are faithful. Men will die for faith sooner than they will die for adjectives. On one long night drive west in January, the colonel's car lost a headlamp, and his driver reduced speed accordingly. They passed a burned-out tanker that still smelled like a sermon. The driver asked permission to stop for a moment. He had a brother on an oil crew. He wanted to take a photograph for a letter he would not send. The colonel allowed it and walked around the wreck. In the light of one remaining lamp, the tanker looked like a book burned half asleep, its pages curled, words still visible if you leaned in close. He read the ghost of a code on the metal and thought, somebody kept the key to this book safe on Malta. Somebody turned the pages with a torpedo. The idea made him quiet for the rest of the night. Near Mareth, he watched French colonial troops dig with the serenity of men who know the ground and have made it their friend. He thought of all the camps where he had joked about Allied waste. Too many men for one trench, too many shovels for one job, and understood finally that redundancy is cheaper than failure. Two to do the work of one had been his sneer. It was also a policy that ensured one still stood when the other slipped. 50,000 gallons was 2 to do the work of 1, on a scale that made contempt childish. He wrote in captivity that logistics had turned him into a monogamist. "I am faithful now," he scribbled in a notebook the camp allowed, "to time, to sequence, to cues. I used to be a seducer of opportunity." He looked around him at men who had been seducers too, and wondered whether their old charm had made them late to the one marriage that mattered. He chose not to preach. He wrote the chalkboard story as if it were a love letter to a truth that had always been waiting for him on the road to El Agela. If the desert has a moral, it is that arithmetic is the only poetry it understands. 50,000 gallons is a sonnet written in hoses and time. The colonel learned to read it late, but he learned to read it. Others will read it earlier next time, and perhaps waste will lose its mask and show itself as margin, the space in which a plan can survive being human.